Hi, everybody. Today we're going to try something a bit different. I want to focus on the importance of maintaining a consistent style in your work. We will begin with a few pieces that I found online. I like the style, I like the colors and everything. However, we will not copy them. We will only try to incorporate these references into our own practice. Okay, so let's begin. For the first portrait, we will use bold strokes of color, but in a more subdued way. We will start by painting the entire composition with a single base color. Then we will choose a secondary color and use it for the shadows, highlights, and a few small details. And after that, we will introduce additional colors for texture and subtle highlights. The result's not bad. It could be stronger, but as an experiment, it works quite well. Now, let's try another approach. We have tried this particular technique before. We basically use a single color for everything, and we play with tones to define shapes, shadows, and highlights. The overall effect is very soft, subtle, and diffused. And once again, there is room for improvements, but it is a very promising direction. Let's move on to the third portrait. This is a style we are very familiar with. We have done this style quite a few times already. We rely on bold blocks of color and construct the composition with very little information. I appreciate how much can be communicated with so little. For the fourth piece, we will focus on very subtle highlights and shadows. Everything remains within essentially the same color family. Only a few highlights are used to emphasize certain areas. The approach is minimalist and restrained, limiting the tonal range even further than the previous ones. And finally, the last one, I did not finish it properly, but it is very simple, and you can see the direction it was beginning to take. Now, when you look at these 5 portraits, none of them is essentially bad. For instance, the first one makes a very good use of color, I think. It is sure a good technique. The second one also works, although perhaps the red would be stronger if it were darker or if we had used a contrasting background. The third one would benefit from a stronger contrast, as the tones here are very similar. The fourth one is slightly more resolved, although it feels somewhat dull, a bit boring, I'd say. And finally, the last one, although unfinished, was moving in a very interesting direction. But what I want you to notice is that it becomes clear that while each portrait functions individually and each one integrates somehow the reference material into our usual approach, together they do not look as if they were created by the same person. This is often what happens when we attempt to emulate too many different sources at once. The question becomes, how do we unify them? So let's start our first painting. I will cover each piece entirely with the same base color. Then I will use a single additional color to define the facial features, as well as the highlights and shadows. And once each piece is done, I may add some small accents here and there. We can examine each reference piece and identify what is it that they have that appeals to us, that moves us, that makes us like the piece as a whole. The priority is cohesion, is connection, even if in order to achieve that, we have to let go of individual elements we admire in our references. We will try to extract the principles, not the visuals. Then we will integrate those elements into a cohesive visual language. This approach will allow the works to function as a unified body rather than 5 isolated pieces. The first step is to define the style we are aiming for. I do encourage you to find the approach you are more comfortable with. It doesn't have to be any that I show here, okay? The key is restraint. Those elements must remain subtle so that they support rather than override your own artistic identity. So, as to me, because I already understand how I draw, how I paint, and I know my palette, my gestures, my instincts, I will simply retain my own visual language and selectively incorporate the elements I respond to. This will be consistent across all 5 works. We have been trying several styles and techniques here for the sake of exercising and everything, but just in case you want to know, out of everything that we have done so far, the 2 directions that I feel most connected to are, firstly, this particular one here, and secondly, the one with a more folk-inspired character, where the figures are slightly exaggerated or out of proportion. These 2 feel closest to my sensibility. Many of you ask about the materials I use or the techniques I follow, and of course, occasionally I mention them. However, I do not expect you to replicate my process. These are the shoes that fit my feet. I would never expect you to wear the same pair I do, since they may not fit your feet. So what I'm trying to say is that what I expect is that you feel encouraged to create, not that you adopt my routine or anybody else's. If following along helps you understand something, that is beautiful, that is great, that is fantastic. However, you should filter your influences and references rather than taking them all in blindly. They should not replace your own investigation. If it happens, your voice will not develop. You will remain in imitation, and that leads to frustration. And frustration leads to quitting. And we do not want you to quit. It is so easy to give up. It is very convenient to give up. It is very easy to start working and convince yourself that you are not improving. It is easy to believe that you are behind. This is specifically true when you are a beginner or when you don't have formal training. But even experienced artists get through periods where everything feels wrong. Proportions seem off. Colors look muddy. The brush feels heavy. Nothing seems to work or make sense. We all have fears. We all have doubts. We all have insecurities. We all question whether any of it matters at all. This is normal. This is part of what makes us humans. But we should fight that kind of thinking, okay, and not let it take over. Another reason many people become discouraged is dissatisfaction with their own results. And often that feeling comes from trying to create someone else's work instead of their own. When you measure your progress by how closely you match what you're trying to emulate, you lose sight of your own development. Reaching the level of artistry that is already within you is not as hard as you might think. It's not as hard as you may think. However, trying to match the level of one artist you admire is challenging. And even more is trying to match several at once. This is just unrealistic. So you may look at artists who have studied anatomy, color theory, and composition for years and feel the need to catch up immediately. You do not. You need mileage, you need volume, you need to sit down and make the work, even when it feels average. So I insist, instead of copying what you admire, identify precisely what attracts you. Is it their use of color, their brushwork, their simplicity, their complexity, their tools? What is that? The artists who improve and eventually stand out aren't necessarily the most gifted. They are the ones who keep showing up despite their doubts, despite their fears, despite their limitations, despite their inner voices. Improvement is not linear, it moves in waves. Sometimes you feel stagnant, sometimes you feel as though you are getting worse. But I think that that happens when your eye develops faster than your hand. So you eventually see more. And when you see more, you also see more flaws, even the ones that aren't actually there. That is not failure. That is growth. So again, most of the time, what you lack is not talent, it's not inspiration or natural ability. Most of time, what you lack is consistency. Consistency does not mean rigidity. It means committing to a visual language long enough to understand it, okay? So when you are constantly shifting from one thing to the next, you might never allow yourself enough time to deepen anything. The work becomes scattered, and scattered work produces scattered confidence. Of course, your work will evolve eventually and naturally because your perspective will shift, your way of seeing will change. And this is not only natural and organic, this is beautiful. That kind of change is evidence of development. Okay, so just to be clear, consistency does not mean that you are not allowed to try or do different things. It only means that they will happen organically, not forcedly or without order or purpose. Over time, your work will eventually shift. Artistic identity is not static, okay? It develops in the same way a person grows. Your ideas and perspectives change over time, yet you remain yourself, right? I'm pretty sure that you are, in essence, the same person you were as a teenager. However, the people you met, the things you experienced, the lessons you've learned, the life you have lived so far has gradually conveyed into what and who you are now. So, growth doesn't erase identity, it refines it. The same applies to art. So instead of asking whether your work is good enough, ask whether you remained within your chosen language long enough to deepen it. Your artistic identity is not something you discover fully formed. If you want resilience, make more work. Not perfect work, more work. Volume reduces fear. So let's recap. Even if I used my characteristic method of painting, the initial 5 pieces did not feel unified, and you could not see progression from one to the next. Now, the second batch, it is a far more cohesive body of work. Even if the pieces are quieter or more restrained, when placed together, they clearly belong to the same family. So here are the results of what we have done today. I hope you've learned something new today and that you can see how consistency plays a crucial role in building a strong portfolio. Experimentation is healthy. However, it is very important to commit to a style that really resonates with you. And once that foundation is clear, you can refine your technique with direction and incorporate elements more organically rather than in a way that feels forced or disconnected. As always, keep on practicing and thank you for joining us.